All right. So we were setting up Al Franken and Tom Davis.
Yeah.
Why don't you just back up and just take us to you said you saw them perform at Zanies and that they were kind of doing like a Bob and Ray kind of thing?
Yeah. Burger. Okay.
I thought you were doing a bit. You're doing like a
Bad timing.
You're doing the super fans.
It's like I'm waiting for the burping until waiting for the camera.
You're having a heart attack there?
No, a heart attack. No, I'm good. So we had.
So you're in Chicago. It's a perfect time.
Yeah.
In the story, I mean.
Oh yes. So Al Franken and Tom Davis were brilliant writers at Saturday Night Live, original writers there, and they're also great performers. They had a segment on the show that they did from time to time, and then they were doing a movie in Chicago, and they cast someone in my show in a major role in their movie, Dave Reynolds, who the guy who ended up writing Finding Nemo, co-writing it, and Oscar nominated, and he got along with them. He's a very social guy. They loved him, so they decided to come see our show, and it was a great night. They seemed very positive about our show. Al was very nice. He was like, "You remind me of a mixture of Eugene Levy and Albert Brooks and any other Jew that you can think of. You're a Jew, is what I'm." He was very nice, and they took us out for beer afterward, and were very complimentary about the show. And I thought, that's great, that's it. But it was nice. It was a great experience. But then, a couple of weeks later, I'm in my house in Chicago reading TV Guide, which is what people read back then. And on the first page, you'd get all your show business news on the first page of the non-glossy section of TV Guide. That was it. And on the non-glossy front page of TV Guide, it said that Lorne Michaels was returning to Saturday Night Live. This is like August of 1985.
Okay.
And that Al Franken and Tom Davis were going to be the producers.
So you didn't know any of that when they were there in Chicago with you?
No.
Okay.
No. I had no idea. And it's the closest feeling I've ever had to the expression hit the ceiling. Just like, this is really happening? These guys who liked our show are producing Saturday Night Live now? So they came back with another person who was working for Lorne, saw the show again. This time we put some extra shit in it. And they were great, very positive again. And then a few of us got to actually audition. Then Lorne Michaels came to Chicago. And there was a talent agency that was setting up auditions. And me and Doug Dale and Hugh Calloway got to do a bit for Lorne. Did a bit where Hugh Calloway played, it's a very low concept, but Hugh Calloway he did a great Clint Eastwood impression. So it was Clint Eastwood hosting a variety show, and the humor of, how, humorless and inappropriate Clint Eastwood would be as a variety host. And Doug and I played the act, which was Pee Wee Herman, Doug and Howie Mandel, me performing Who's on First. We were both guys with a lot of props and silly. It was a comedy bit. It was a bit about comedy. So it was just about Pee Wee and Howie destroying Who's on First.
So you're using
with prop
a
humor.
Classic comedy bit.
Yes.
And you're doing an impression of a comedian.
Yes.
Deconstructing that classic comedy bit.
Yes. So I was Howie Mandel and Doug was Pee Wee.
Do you still do Howie? Of that era?
He just made a lot of noises, I remember. He's just always smiling. I do what or what? What? Wait. He did that kind of stuff. And then he basically put a rubber glove on his face and inflated it. And then it would pop off.
And you did that?
Oh yeah.
You were able to inflate the rubber glove?
Yes, it was. I went to rubber glove inflation school. It's only like a 2-week course. Some people do it by mail, but I went to the school. No, yes, I taught myself how to do that, and
All right, so now was your hope that you would get cast on SNL?
I had no hope of anything in my life. I just loved being in Chicago doing a funny show. I couldn't believe it was selling out. When I actually got Saturday Night Live, there was a part of me that wished that this had happened a few years later because I was so happy in Chicago. My parents weren't happy. They were nervous. Because in my mind, I was a success because I was part of a successful show. We didn't even have to work. We had moved it to yet a bigger theater now, and we were selling out. We only needed to do like 3 or 4 shows a weekend to split about, I don't know, I think the profits were ultimately like $3,500. We would split them 7 ways. We're 7 people in the group at this point. And that was enough to live in Chicago. I was living in an apartment where I was splitting rent with 2 other people. I was paying $150 in rent, and I was making $350 a week just doing this show for like 3 nights, 2 on Saturday and Friday and Thursday or something like that. So I was in heaven, and I met this girl that I loved, and we were preparing another show. I was so happy, but still, Saturday Night Live, it's the dream.
All right, so you do this audition, then what?
Well, Lorne was clearly only interested in Doug Dale, and he made it clear in the audition. He didn't ask he or me any questions. He said, "So, Doug, where are you from? Mm-hmm. And how long have you known other people than these 2? And what are your interests in comedy? And do you think these other 2 are getting the idea? All right, off with you." And that was my first encounter with Lorne. I was like in complete awe and a little humiliated at the same time. But they flew us all to New York because then I submitted material, and all 3 of us got to fly to New York with Joan Cusack, who had been chosen out of a different comedy group that she was in with Jeremy Piven at the time. And 4 of us flew there and were interviewed. And Lorne told me, "You're one of those people we don't know quite what to do with. You perform, but you write, and you are a mama's boy." And and I was like,
you didn't really say that you were a mama's boy.
No. But I was, in his mind, I could tell. My whole first year at SNL, I felt like the biggest nerd, because I was. But he, I got hired. Doug got to audition further and was just beaten out by John Lovitz. He was like the last guy who didn't make it.
Wow.
And it was.
So were you surprised you got hired as a writer?
Not at that point, I wasn't, because I was surprised, yes, that I was hired at all, but not that it was as a writer as opposed to a performer. Because by then, I still loved performing, but I didn't think I was the funniest guy in my show. I thought Doug was, and I thought I was maybe somewhere in the middle. There was another guy, this guy Hugh Cowley, who I also thought was way more talented as a performer. And so I had no designs or feelings like I was being, unfairly excluded. I was shocked that I'd even gotten this far. And all I thought about when I got the job was, for a while, was, I hope I don't fuck this up. And I was starting to have nightmares, and then I just stopped myself. I just said, "You're going to enjoy this. You're not going to ruin this before it even happens." And I stopped having nightmares, and I just went in there.
So set the stage, 2 things.
Yeah.
First of all, you're doing your impression of Lorne.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of an interesting moment in terms of Lorne's own trajectory. He'd done the
Yes.
first 5 years of the show. He
Yes.
went away. This is his first year back.
He had done the new show
The new show.
on prime time, and it had failed. It was a pre-taped version of Saturday Night Live that had a lot of different issues, had a lot of good writing, brilliant writing in it, but didn't have quite the cast, and it lacked the live energy that had, lent so much to SNL.
So how, whether in the moment or maybe in retrospect, how do you feel Lorne sort of was in terms of his clarity, his sense of purpose or confidence or anything sort of going into like re-entering the world of Saturday Night Live in this moment? Because you were there from
Right.
like, when he came back.
Well, I was there, but I didn't have a lot of access to him. I was kept at a distance. He was fairly aloof, but I had contact with him, and he would meet with us every Monday and give advice. And he was definitely in a position where I think he felt like he was being evaluated in his own way. Like, I don't think this was his dream to come back to SNL at the time. He wanted to produce and make movies and things like that. And then he came back, and I think he picked a lot of cast members that had movie experience and not so much sketch experience. And I think he wanted to redefine the show in an aggressive way by not embracing the sketch community as much. And it might have been... he might have been more interested than he realized he should be at the time in being, as hip as possible, as opposed to going with necessarily the most solid sketch-based performers. So
Well, talk about that cast and that
Yeah.
writing staff. It is a really interesting year to look at,
Yeah.
again, sort of analytically.
well, the writing staff was as good a writing staff as I've ever been a part of. I mean, had Al Franken and Tom Davis, had George Meyer, had Jim Downey. These are all-time great comedy writers. It had,
Let's talk about those guys each.
Yeah.
First of all, so Franken and Davis coming back, they're obviously in a kind of a senior role. What was your...
they were producers.
Yeah, so what
Yes.
was your experience of them?
Well, I think they had a rough year because they, I think they kind of ended up taking a bit of the fall at the end of the year. And to some degree, I think the show had an excessive amount in the network's eyes of like the kind of cut and slash humor as it was described back in the Michael O'Donoghue days, and kind of sort of shock, dark humor. Like the show opened with Brandon Tartikoff, a cold open where he standing in front of like the urine samples of cast members. I don't remember what was in the news, but it was about them all being, he was assuring the show that nobody was, that they'd all been drug tested and that they were all clean. And then there was a sketch about National Enquirer Theater where it was basically the National Enquirer doing a dramatization of some historical event. And in this case, it was about the Kennedys. And I believe
Right.
Madonna played Marilyn Monroe, and the sketch ended with the Kennedys suffocating her. It was very dark.
I remember that. It was
Yeah.
Randy Quaid as JFK and Anthony Michael Hall as Bobby,
That sounds right.
and I think Terry Sweeney as Teddy.
Sounds right.
I remember this sketch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just remember the ending was really disturbing. And these are like the funniest guys in the world, but they had, everybody wanted to leave their mark in a way that would redefine the show. And Al and Tom had very dark sensibilities. They could also be very Bob and Ray, but that's where that first show went. And that first show kind of defined the entire season. It wasn't unlike the Dana Carvey experience I had with the, Bill Clinton and his nipples. But it was very similar in that everybody called the season dead on arrival, and
This
the show was
so Madonna
universally
hosted.
panned. Yes, Madonna hosted. And the sketch I wrote, I did get a sketch on that show, and it was the most, probably the least offensive and the silliest and just a useless bit of fluff that was where she played. I just thought she would be funny as a Spanish variety show hostess. So, which was fun because I got to be one of her backup singers. She was the biggest star in the universe at the time, and I wrote a mashup of the song "Take on Me" and La Bamba, and she sang it, and it was a lot of fun, but not a very memorable sketch conceptually, but
What was that first show like, though, for you?
it was just fascinating, and then kind of just having water thrown in your face at the end, because I remember the read through that week and just everything killing, and me just thinking I'm just around the most amazing people on earth. These are just every sketch is hysterical, and then the show happens and half of these sketches end up bombing. And it was a learning experience. It was just like, okay, so what works at the table a lot has to go into it translating for an audience. And, a lot of factors have to be right for that to work. Sometimes it's the cast, sometimes it's just the overall dynamic of the show and the balance of sketches. And that was just the beginning of an amazing learning process. And early on, when I first got to SNL, I was trying to write weird, David Letterman was the coolest show on television, even though I was so overwhelmed by being there, loved the show so much, knew everybody on the credit roll, I would meet Edie Baskin and I was like, yes, I love your hand-tinted bumper, they're hand-tinted, right? Are you? Leo Yoshimura, you were Sulu in the Michael O'Donoghue epic Star Trek sketch, and it's an honor okay, nice to meet you. And I was such a nerd, and I don't think Lauren had much faith in me, because part of it was just the way I carried myself. I was just didn't know how to talk, just so overwhelmed. The kids in the hall had been hired, Mark McKinney and Bruce McCullough, they'd been hired as writers, and they had the right haircuts, they were buzz cut on the sides. This was the 80s. They had the right haircuts, and they wore...
I'd forgotten those guys were on that staff.
Yes. They had the haircuts, and they knew to wear, their overcoats were, I would wear a down jacket, and they would wear, nice, wool coats. I mean, they just knew, and I didn't. I was such a nerd, and I just had my Jufro that I was hanging on to from 1978, and I just and I could tell that I was not fitting in, and this little part of me that wears honesty on my sleeve from my parents, just this kind of self-righteousness, that morality that that could be pulled out of me, just made me just defiant. I'm not gonna suck up. I'm not gonna do it. I'm gonna be judged on my work, and I'm gonna live or die. I'll just go back to Chicago if my sketches aren't good enough. So I never made an effort to suck up to Lauren or to anybody, really. I was nice and cordial, but in my mind, that's how I saw it. I saw it as this is who I am. I can't help it. And I'm just going to fucking work really hard. But early on, I didn't know what he wanted. And I would write really strange stuff. Dick Ebersol had the season before. and they had started to do a lot of film pieces. So early on, I wrote a lot of film pieces, and Lorne had no interest in doing
Really?
that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because that's when like Chris Guest started
Yeah.
directing all of those
Yeah.
really amazing film pieces.
Yeah.
That was the prior year.
Yes, and Lorne almost defiantly rejected the idea of
That's
that.
so
And he was all
interesting.
about the live show.
Yeah, because he had certainly had Albert Brooks, and he had
Yeah.
Mr. Bill, and he had the
No,
Tom
that's
Schiller.
different. That's like compartmentalized film.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not like film taking over the show.
Right.
That's not cast members doing their own ideas and putting them on film, that kind of thing. But that's what I was writing early on. I wrote a sketch about, I don't know, I would submit things like two guys who just happen upon themselves on the street, and you know how people who don't really want to talk have conversations and they just keep walking. Hey, how you doing? Good. Oh, you too? Yeah. And how's the kids? Yeah. Okay. And I'm, yeah. So we should get together. Yeah. And then they're going to be, she's doing great. And so in my sketch, they just keep having the conversation going further and further back.
And there's no way to stage that as a live sketch.
No. It was a film. And they're dodging, miraculously avoiding cars and they're screaming at the top of their lungs. And then at the very end, they back into each other on the other side of the earth. And
You never got to make that piece?
no, not even close.
Oh, that's so
No,
great.
there was no. I mean, Jim Downey liked it. Jim Downey would encourage these things. And then
Talk
I wrote
about
one.
Jim Downey, because you've always sort of cited him as somebody that you found that you got a lot of, I think,
Inspiration.
inspiration and guidance and even
Absolutely.
mentorship from.
100%.
So talk about what kind of guy Jim Downey was.
Well, he was the most charming, funny guy in the building. First of all, he just, everybody was in love with him. Everybody was literally in love with him. He was so funny and just this charismatic, handsome guy, great performer. Like he would act out bits in the driest way possible, and we all thought, I wish he was in the cast because he can really deliver writer's lines, and he's got one of the most famous lines in comedy movies ever, which is this passage in Billy Madison that he wrote, which the everyone is dumber for having heard your presentation, and the whole speech he did, when Adam is competing against Bradley Whitford, I guess. So, he's had his moments, and the Change Bank commercials that happened in like 1990 or something were two of the funniest commercial parodies ever, and Jim is the anchor of them. But he was a fantastic writer, as funny as anybody, could add anything to your sketch, but also had incredibly high standards. He always
You described him once as a standard bearer at SNL.
without a doubt, he'd have certain phrases that would seep into your brain that you'd never forget, like you'd pitch something or you'd hear a pitch and he's like, that's a first idea, we can do better than that. That works, but we can find a less obvious, more challenging, more satisfying ultimate way of commenting on whatever was going on. And that was one of them. And he would always, he would sort of dissect, he had a knack of dissecting how a sketch, breaking down the gimmick, like he would say there's often just two kinds of sketches on SNL. One is crazy person in a normal situation and normal people in a crazy situation. And that was shockingly true.
Right.
Writers always prefer normal people, crazy situation. And performers very often want to be the crazy person who everybody's like, huh? You're not the norm. And then cut back to the crazy person carrying the sketch.
Now, a couple of things occurred to me when you were talking. First of
Yeah.
all, how important did you come to find it to be? Because a big part of SNL is that first read through. Everybody reads their sketches.
Yeah.
And it sounds like Downey really sold his stuff really well. So how important was it for a writer to be able to, in that read through, kind of help push their stuff forward so it would make the cut?
I don't know how you would do it other than writing for the right cast member, prepping them beforehand, letting them know what the sketch is, what you're hoping for, and
But how did you figure that out?
how did I figure that out?
Yeah.
Just trial and error. You just see how the show works, and you realize, oh well, I better talk to the writer, talk to the performer before read through, because I've got to sell the sketch at read through. And then there's steps before that. There's like the Monday meeting, where everybody famously meets in Lauren's office. Everybody's sitting on the floor mostly, and the guest is sitting on the other side of Lauren's desk. And one by one, everybody pitches something to the host. And I realized very early on that if you pitch something that kills in the room, it's not going to do as well at read through, because there will be this expectation attached to it, and the element of surprise will be gone, and everybody will be like recognizing the premise already, as opposed to, and now their expectations are either going to be met or they're going to be satisfied, but they're not going to be jolted into surprise. I would call it Monday's hero, Wednesday's goat. And like some people, like Tom Davis, would just rattle through like 5 hysterical ideas and then never write any of them. And I tended to start doing that. And a lot of people do now. They lie and they make up something, and then they don't ever have any intention of pitching. Oddly enough, when I went back for the first time in, I don't know, 20 years, I spent a week at SNL writing for Adam Sandler because he asked me to. And I found myself right by the door, and Lauren called on me in that meeting, and I blurted out something that I really did think I would write. And it got an enormous laugh, and then the read-through, it didn't do that great. I was like,
So the dynamic is unchanged.
Yeah, it hadn't changed, and I had not heeded my earlier
You didn't have that muscle
advice to
memory,
myself.
You can call upon that.
Yeah, I was more nervous about killing in the room because I just felt like, oh, this is weird. I'm pitching, and
Right.
I really wanted to kill in that moment. So I just blurted out the idea I really had that I thought
You were
was
Monday's
funny.
hero.
I was Monday's hero, exactly, and that was enough for the old man at that moment.
All right. So the other thing about Downey, because I think
Yeah.
it's really interesting,
Yeah.
particularly with the way that writing staff ultimately would be configured in the years during sort of the early part of your tenure there.
Yeah.
So he was this like Harvard Lampoon guy.
Yes,
As was George Meyer. Right?
as was George Meyer, and I wonder if there weren't anybody else Al and Tom were Harvard guys. Al was a Harvard guy. Tom hung out with Al during his Harvard years. But there were at least 3 major Harvard guys there, yeah.
And then ultimately there would come to be more.
Oh,
right?
God, yeah.
So how did you sort of, because it feels like those Harvard Lampoon guys, this is my
Yeah.
arm's length observation, you can tell me if you think this is true, kind of have like almost their own like comedy secret handshake.
Yes, they do. Not all of them. Conan almost defiantly, even though he was as successful as any Harvard Lampoon guy had ever been at the Lampoon, he was the only guy elected to run the place 2 years in a row. But when we started hiring people at the Conan show in '93, neither of us were particularly, neither of us were necessarily inclined to, go out of our way to hire people from Harvard. I wasn't from Harvard, but Conan knew a lot of people, and he absolutely, and he almost defined it as like a certain kind of, he was actually afraid of it to some degree because he
Well, how
thought of
would
it
you
as
define
excessively
it?
dry and precious. There was a preciousness to it in his mind, and Conan can be very silly and broad, and he enjoyed that aspect of it, and we ended up hiring a lot more Chicago people as a result. Also, it had a little bit to do with like, the course we had set ourselves on, which was I had said from the beginning, like, let's do sketch comedy on this show. There wasn't any at the time on any of these other shows. So that already sort of set us on the path away from Harvard and more toward Chicago. But going back to Jim Downey,
Right.
he was a Harvard guy, but he didn't necessarily have any kind of, he didn't fetishize the Harvard lifestyle at all, I don't think. He was a Midwest guy, and he appreciated people from, from weird parts of the country. Like John Swartzwelder was from Houston, and he just had a very odd sensibility in his writing, and he was my roommate. He shared an office with me
Who's Swartzwelder?
my first year, yeah. And he was fascinating, chain-smoking, kind of solitary guy, but talkative but solitary at the same time.
Interesting.
Yeah. And he ended up being maybe the greatest Simpsons writer ever. So he was there, and Jack Handey is probably the writer that more writers revere in the history of SNL than anyone, I would think.
And like you, one of the few that sort of got to have that kind of name recognition.
Yeah, although a lot of people, he's still hounded by people who think Jack Handey's like a fictional character. But yes, Deep Thoughts, it was great for him. It gave him a brand, and he was able to market Deep Thoughts, so he more than deserved it. But like, people don't realize the amazing sketches that he wrote as well.
Well, let's talk about some of the stuff that happened during that first year, because it is a really interesting year. So,
Yeah.
First of all, the second show, I understand, was probably, for everybody who worked there, as interesting as that first show with Madonna, which was when Chevy
Chase hosted.
Yeah, do you have any memories of that?
Well, I remember what happened in the room that was documented very... it's interesting. I understand how people feel about Chevy Chase, and he's become kind of he's like a dartboard that everybody feels comfortable calling an asshole, and perhaps some of his behavior has been objectionable, but I always find it interesting when everybody just agrees to zero in on one guy as if everyone else is just, is just completely free of any kind of peccadillo or odd behavior or objectionable, outbursts. So, but having said that, yes, Chevy Chase came in and said whatever the hell he felt like saying. He's one of those guys who, and Franken had some of this too, where they just rather be funny than think even for a split second about anyone else's reaction or how it would affect anyone else. Kind of like I was when I was 10. And, to some degree, I still had that problem. And I think you kind of need it as a sketch writer. Like, it's a young man's game, I always say, because, you should be ruthless as a sketch writer at Saturday Night Live and fearless. But there are sketches I wrote when I was in my 20s that I would never have written in my 40s. Making fun of certain people who were going through hard times, whether they were people I knew or other situations. You just take in life experiences and you start to cross off areas that are just not funny to you anymore. Mm-hmm. But in Chevy's case, I guess he was into his 40s at this time. And yes, he was very funny, but then he made a joke in a pitch session about let's monitor Terry Sweeney's weight. over the next every episode. Let's wait.
Two things that are
Terry.
important to mention here is Terry Sweeney was the first
openly gay cast member, and the AIDS crisis was at its height.
So
Not funny.
This is Chevy's pitch.
This is Chevy's pitch. And it was classic SNL, Michael O'Donoghue, cut and slash. You know, it's funny because it's wrong. Humor. And Al and Tom, they didn't put that on the air. Even Al and Tom had their limits. That was never going on the air. But I've heard Al make some crazy pitches to people in his time. And this one from Chevy was a classic. It was. In how wrong it was.
So ultimately, there were some high points in the season.
Oh, yeah.
So Lovitz really kind of was the breakout of that year.
Well, yes, the pathological liar and the master thespian characters were hit characters. Nora Dunn had a hit with Pat Stevens and had some other successful characters. And Dennis Miller was, amazingly successful on Update. That's a hard position. Really, Chevy Chase, talk about positive about Chevy Chase that everyone agrees on is that his Weekend Update persona was, the first thing that anybody latched onto at Saturday Night Live, and it was hysterical, and he is an incredibly funny guy, and that was his apex, and that Weekend Update, that version of Weekend Update cast a shadow for years, and Dennis was really the first one to kind of break through and, cast his own shadow after that. So those three were definitely the standouts. I thought other people were doing great. Randy Quaid was actually really funny, had a lot of great moments on the show. And Joan Cusack, I feel like, could have easily been a great Saturday Night Live cast member.
Yeah, people forget about Joan Cusack. Also, I think Robert Downey Jr.
Robert Downey Jr. did pretty well. He was not, but then the next year, Dana Carvey and Phil Hartman and Jan Hooks all audition, and there's just sort of a shock to your system. Like, this is what
right.
an amazing Saturday Night Live cast member, what an amazing cast member is supposed to be. Those three people embody that. But I do feel like Joan, especially, if she had Jan Hooks in her cast, she would have been able to shine at everything that's great about her. The way Victoria Jackson got to that year. Like, Victoria wasn't asked to do a million different variations. And Joan's one of the funniest women I've ever met, one of the funniest people I've ever met.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I don't know if you would agree with this, but I've always thought like SNL casts are like sports teams in that everybody is kind of got to be a role player for the team to succeed.
Right.
And there's very few sort of Michael Jordans of SNL.
Right.
But you can see.
But it really helps to have like a couple of them, and we had like 3 that year.
But
as soon as those guys joined the cast.
Before we get to that cast, so just a couple of other things from your first year. So, what do you remember about the Damon Wayans incident where he wound up getting fired? Because that's a pretty notorious moment in SNL.
So that was a sketch. So Andy Breckman, another absolute genius comedy writer, had joined the show that March, and for a few episodes. On this particular show, he had 3 sketches in. All of them were very funny. This one was called Mr. Monopoly, and it was John Lovitz was playing the guy with the, handlebar mustache on the Monopoly board, brought to life. I really don't remember anything about the sketch other than Damon was a bit player in the background, and he was just a straight man. And he had a couple of lines, and then on air he decided to make his character over-the-top gay. And out of nowhere, it didn't get laughs. It had nothing to do with the logic of the sketch. And Lauren and Andy Breckman were both shocked and upset. And I think Lauren told Damon, you realize I have to fire you. That's like the ultimate rule you can't break. That's like gambling on a baseball team. If you're the Chicago White Sox, you're undermining the very
Damon went rogue.
foundation. Sorry, he
Damon-
went rogue, and I think Lauren just felt like you cannot give an inch when it comes to the fragility, protecting the fragility of a live television show, and that's something he held very dear, and it was something that was very precious to him. He was a lover of live television from the 50s, and Saturday Night Live really was the only thing left on television that evoked, that era of Sid Caesar and all that stuff. And oddly enough, back then it was considered a dinosaur, and people would always say to me, when does it tape? Or why is it live? Why does it have to be live? Nobody cares. And it's ironic because here we are 30, 40 years later, and the fact that it's live is the most valuable. Like with everything that's happened in television now, the fact that this is a live moment that that everybody's going to talk about right after it happens, it's this weapon that, has become so valuable to the show in the era we live in now.
I also love Lauren's line about the show doesn't go on because it's ready, it goes on because it's at 11:30.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, that's a classic Laurenism. And it's true. The show's never ready, and his tombstone's going to read uneven, I believe, is his other line. And all of that is true, but the fact that we now live in a world where we're all standing by the water cooler together, just from our houses, just on our laptops, on Twitter, that event television is a big deal. And so Saturday Night Live has become this thing that everybody analyzes right after it happens. Back then, we used to make fun of Lauren because it would only get reviewed once a year for the season premiere, and it would only be we'd be prepping the season premiere, and Lauren would say something like, "So really, that's what you want the critics to be analyzing? The critics?" And we would just laugh like, what critics? It's going to be Tom Shales and the New York Post. Literally, that's it. The rest of the world just doesn't pay attention. And it was kind of true. And but then sort of it happened kind of like right as I left the show, everything turned and the internet became a giant water cooler. And I think it really started to peak when Tina played Sarah Palin. Right. There was this giant explosion where the show became just everything that we dreamed it would be all those years while I was working on it. And I had just left. In like the spring of 2008. It was like I walked out of the building and fireworks went off. It really made me laugh. And ever since then, the show has, had this whole other life of being this event that people anticipate and then talk about.
So, in terms of
going back to, yes.
No. Because what's interesting is there was a kind of almost sort of anticipating that quality of the show. There was a kind of almost navel-gazing end to your first season.
Oh, yes. That was my bit.
That was your bit,
yeah.
which I think is so interesting because it was one of the few times, I think, to that point that the show had reflected itself in its own content in a way.
Yes.
So talk about that because it's really interesting because it was. Were you aware that the show was on the precipice of cancellation?
Oh God, why would I have written it if I hadn't been?
Okay, well, so talk about what led to what you wrote for the ending, and then talk about that ending itself.
Yes. So yes, as you know, I like writing meta and self-referential stuff sometimes. By this time, I had been beaten into submission, though, and I was writing SNL sketches all season long. Like, I wasn't writing any weird, like I said, the beginning of the year, I was writing stuff like, hidden camera show, like a practical jokes on animals, where it's like, watch this turtle's reaction when he realizes it's a Burt Reynolds impersonator and not the real Burt. And, smash zoom on the indifferent turtle. Jim Downey loved it, but nowhere.
That's such a Smigel bit.
Yeah. But I was writing the purest, funniest stuff that I loved, and then I just got nothing on the show. And then Tom Hanks came on, and I did these three guys who all sound like Seinfeld clones talking to each other backstage, and that saved my job. I might have been fired if I hadn't done that bit.
I remember that sketch.
What's the deal with it? And they're just having a bad conversation. And it wasn't necessarily making fun of Seinfeld as much as the fact that style of that became a conversational style that comedians had on stage. There's so many people who had that rhetorical kind of, that's not exactly the kind of thing that I think should be happening. I don't know about you, but I no. So.
And you feel that sketch saved your job?
I'm almost certain it did.
Wow.
Because the beginning of the year, George Meyer said, don't worry, he was great. He was a mentor too. And he said, Lorne never fires people. He gives everybody a year. So just take your time. You'll ease into it. But by the fifth show, I had gotten nothing on since the Madonna sketch. And I was starting to get nervous, and George was too. He was hearing rumblings that Lorne might fire some people because the show was on the ropes. And Tom Hanks came on, and I was a huge Tom Hanks fan. I loved Bosom Buddies. I thought he was one of the funniest people I'd ever seen in a sitcom. And this was me letting out my disdain for observational kind of comedy. But again, even by then I'd realized, I thought Jerry Seinfeld was amazing and like the best version of this, but there were many comedians doing mediocre versions. So again,
Seinfeld.
Yes, so I had three guys and they were all wearing the knit tie back then. They had the knit tie that wasn't totally up to the collar. It was like half loose, and that's how they'd walk around. A lot of times they'd have these jackets where they'd roll up the sleeves. The height of 80s bad choices. And and it was a big hit sketch. And I remember I taped every show, and I just remember going home and watching it like 7 times in a row. I was just like, I can't believe I can die now. This happened. People really, really liked this one, and I just couldn't believe it. But I didn't realize that it pretty much did save my job. I mean, I think I got like a couple of good ones on in January that cemented it. And if I hadn't, and then I almost got fired that summer. So anyway, let's take it to the end of the year.
The end of the year.
So a big trend in television had become cliffhangers ever since the Who Shot JR episode of Dallas, which was enormous for CBS in the early 80s. Now everybody was ending on a cliffhanger. All these soap opera kind of, I can't remember, primetime soaps, I think they call them.
Right.
Dynasty was as big or bigger than Dallas by now. So I had the idea that our show should end with a cliffhanger, and it was a perfect season to do it because really we didn't know what was going to happen. So Billy Martin the show was in such bad straits that not only would they have a host, but then they would have sort of a secondary and guest starring, and they would have people on like Jimmy Breslin and Catherine Oxenberg would both be on at the same time. I'm pretty sure that happened. They would have things like that or maybe it was Catherine Oxenberg and Paul Simon, kind of both in sketches. Jimmy Breslin and Marvin Hagler in another episode.
Oh,
yeah, and in ours it was...
People are going to be Googling like mad during this stretch of the interview.
I know. Well, and then for the last show of the season, this was a perfectly logical combination. Angelica Houston and Billy Martin, the ex-manager of the Yankees. So there was some kind of running gag about Billy Martin and his drinking or something. I don't even remember what other people were working on, but I had this idea that Billy Martin would be bitter at Lorne and set the studio on fire, and Lorne would run into, the green room or wherever the cast was hanging out, and or no, he wouldn't. I can't remember if the cast was in. Anyway, he only pulls John Lovitz, and he sends the writers. He says, "I think your checks are over there." Like, he sends them into the fire. I made sure there was a joke about the writers in there because I did feel a little bit of, the empathy chip had started to sink in by the time I was 25. So I had some sympathy for the other cast members for having done this, but fell under the category of too funny not to do in my mind. And some people were upset. Some of the cast members were upset, but by the end of the show, they were okay. They got it. But
And then I remember in the end crawl, the credits.
that was Jim Downey's idea, putting a question mark after every name. Yeah, he gave me that.
Brilliant.
It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how the season ends.
Yes, with the fire cliffhanger.
And then you say, so the show almost doesn't get picked up. It does. Brandon Tartikoff, I think, had decided to cancel it. Then he decided to bring it back.
And Lorne had to replace a lot of cast. He had to remove Al and Tom as producers. And Jim Downey became the head writer above Al and Tom. And Al they were just writers. They just came back as writers. Wow. Yeah. And
then you kind of had to sing for your supper again.
Yes. Well, over the summer, first I got a call from Al saying, yeah, it doesn't look great. I don't know. You did good. You did really good. But it's tough. There's a lot of people that are probably, who is going to probably make it? Swartzwell. Wasn't he funny? Like, yeah, it's not the perfect time for me to revel in the success of another writer, but sure, Al. I love John. He's great. Then I really thought I was going to be fired. So I went back to Chicago, and Bob Odenkirk and I, who had become a big friend of mine, who I'd met through the Players Workshop, I moved in. He had taken over my apartment, and I moved back in with him. And we were writing a sketch show together. And a couple of the bits that I had thought of were in the year 2000 for that show.
Wow.
That ended up being on Conan. And geez, I can't remember. We had a couple that ended up turning into something later. But then I got a call, and I heard 3 people went to Lorne. 3 people who Lorne was keeping and were kind of now in the pack, like in his coterie of advisors. And they all, Lovitz, Dennis Miller, and A. Whitney Brown all recommended that I be rehired.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think that's why Lorne considered rehiring me, because of those guys. And so I got a call. I was in Chicago still. This is like mid-September. So there's concern, meaning that he was concerned. He was basically telling me what he didn't like about me. You didn't write that well for the women. Yeah, I know. I'm a nerd and I know more about men. I'll try harder. And you didn't. Sometimes you would talk to the cast, and this is something I did because I had this bratty side to me that came from the defiance of, I'm just gonna let my work speak for itself. But there were a couple of instances where I gave the cast notes that didn't necessarily coincide with Lorne's notes. And that really pissed him off. Rightfully so. I didn't understand it at the time. At the time, I thought, this show's bleeding, man. And I know what to do with this sketch. It was disrespectful and stupid because it's just like, now I produce shows and I understand if anybody, your ass is on the line. It's your show. You can't have people just defying you. So there was that, and I feel like there was one other. What sketch were you most proud of? He asked me, and I said the cliffhanger, because I felt like I'd helped the show by allowing us to laugh at our own, acknowledge the trouble we had, and make something funny out of it. All right, I'll get here Monday, and couldn't be more upset about it.
Do you really feel
No,
you were
of course he didn't say that.
rehired reluctantly?
No, I don't think it was reluctant, but it was like there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm to it. But I wasn't hurt this time at all, because I know the shit he was going through.
Right.
And I was like, okay, I guess this is how I'm going back.
All right,
And-
so now let's jump into this second year, because your second year there, and it's night and day from the previous year in terms of the show and how it's being received and the cast.
Yes.
So talk
and
about,
also my success at the show.
Yeah, so let's go through all of that.
Well, so what was very interesting was that the show was attacked savagely 1985, 1986. And I don't think anything was savaged more than the writing. But I knew that the assemblage of writer talent was through the roof, amazing. And I think what happened was that, but the cast was, I didn't think the cast was bad, but I think there were people who just weren't home run hitting sketch performers. So I found it really interesting that despite how savage the writing staff was, a lot of writers were retained anyway. A fair amount of the writing staff stayed intact, and the cast changed a lot more. So I gave Lauren credit for understanding how talented the people and the writing staff were, and
What were the
understanding that
changes then,
dynamic.
other than that flip of sort of Downey and Franken and Davis? What were the other?
Well, there were other writers who were let go. I mean, Mark McKinney and Bruce McCullough went back to The Kids in the Hall, and Carol Leifer, who went on to write for Seinfeld, and John Swartzwelder, unfortunately, was let go. And but people like George Meyer, Andy Breckman, we're all back. Jack Handy was actually let go for a few months and then brought back. Unthinkable, really, that even happened. But he didn't have a lot of success that first year. And then they brought in a few new writers, but not that many. It was really about the cast. And
You mentioned Carol Leifer. Were there any other women in that era?
E. Jean Carroll,
Okay.
who we all know now
Yeah.
from the Donald Trump story,
Yeah.
wrote and went on to become a very successful magazine columnist. Actually, E. Jean Carroll, she was there the second year. I'm sorry. She was not there the Robert Downey year. So E. Jean Carroll joined the staff in 1986. Writers from the furrow. There was a writer named Susie Schneider who was let go the first year, the first 6 months.
It's interesting, just because you referenced that Lauren said you didn't
Write
very
for the
much.
women that way.
Yeah, so like,
Yeah.
it's just interesting because I know much has been made historically, sort of in the pre-Tina Fey years,
Yeah.
that writing staff was kind of held up as an example of very much a boys' club. Was that anything anybody was aware of or talking about at the time? That it was so...
I'm sure the women were. The guys were like, okay, so how about 3 aliens who, turn into pirates, and it's a whole Planet of the Apes parody. And, but Yeah, it was, well, that's a whole other story. Like, to me, Sherry O'Terry sort of set the show on a completely different course like 10 years later. But that's a whole different thing. Here, Nora would write for herself, and had some success. Jan didn't write at all, hardly. She co-wrote the Sweeney Sisters bits and would write occasionally, but she was so versatile that she had no trouble being on the show all the time. And to me, that's, just emblematic of how amazing she was as a performer. Because it was a bunch of guys writing for the most part. Two people were brought in that were friends of Jan, Bonnie and Terry Turner.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, they're friends of hers from Atlanta. And they wrote some amazing stuff for her. But she was by no means dependent on any one writer. She got on the show all the time via, many different, voices. So that first show, there was a sketch, I remember it really well. It was called Game Show Psychic. Andy Breckman wrote it. May have been the first sketch coming out of the monologue. And it was Phil was the MC, and Jan and Dana were the contestants, and Dana happened to be a psychic. And a very simple premise, but it was like watching a different show. It's just three. And Jim Downey said, look at this, same writers. He's like almost gloating. See, same writers, but now the audience feels safe. That's exactly how he put it.
Wow.
The audience feels safe.
And you could feel that too.
100%. These guys just walked in like they'd been doing it for 10 years.
Well, I remember from that first show, because I knew Carvey from the stand-up world,
Yeah.
that he did the chopping broccoli in that
Oh,
first
Carvey had this Church Lady and Chopping Broccoli.
Yes, that's right. They were both on the first show.
Yeah, and Chopping Broccoli the show was so loaded that Chopping Broccoli was like the last sketch of the night. It was like on at 12:55. And it was still, something everybody talked about. Yeah, that show was just night and day, because now the writers realized, now all we have to do is just, these guys are going to grab us by the hand and take us soaring. And it was very exciting and completely different.
So let's talk about a couple of these cast members that loomed so large in that year, but also with whom you did some really notable work.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about Carvey, because obviously you guys forged such a great relationship.
Yeah, he's one of the 2 or 3 people that I was closest to in my time there as a writer and as a person, but also as just a, creative force. He and I, a lot of my writing that I enjoyed the most was just improvising while doing an impression, That's the kind of writing I love to do. And I do a lot of impressions. I'm not Dana Carvey. And that was also sort of very kind of relaxing, because I was a performer and I always thought of myself as I'm pretty good at this. And then that whole first year with that other cast, there was still a part of me that was like, I don't know, maybe I'm better than I think. Maybe I could do this for a living. And then Dana and Phil show up and I'm like, right. You have to be that good. That's how good you're supposed to be. And it was great, because then Dana just became this vessel where if I had an idea for an impression, I could do it with Dana, and I could give him some hooks and he would come up with things, and it would go from, there were variations, like Johnny Carson, we both had different things that we lent to that. Like I had noticed that in the 80s, after Letterman came on, Johnny suddenly seemed a little square, even though he was still Johnny and hilarious, but he seemed to almost overcompensate at times. Like, he tried to do a Letterman bit once, and he set it up so painstakingly that it was like where he was going to go out of the studio and, bother a stagehand about something. And he was like, we're going to do something. It's a little weird, a little skewed, a little out there. Yes, Ed, yes. Not the norm. That's right. I am going to walk out of the studio. The camera's going to follow me. I'm going to speak off the cuff. Improvisation. That kind of is
So
just
you
so
wrote
much
those pieces
setup.
for Dana and Phil as Johnny and Ed.
Well, actually, Bonnie and Terry wrote the first one, and then I kind of started talking to Dana and said, "There's a lot of stuff he does that we could play with here, you know," and I, you know, where he would like, "This is a little weird, a little skewed," and Dana had this thing, weird, wild stuff, because he had a thing where when Johnny would see him perform and other comedians, he would, at the end, you know, they look for the signal, like from Johnny, and Johnny would say, funny stuff. And so it was that whole side of Johnny, like kind of the old man part of him that was taking in the new comedy.
So many of Dana's characters had
Yeah.
those great catchphrases. How much of that was
Yeah.
Dana finding that when he was doing the impression, or you or another writer collaborating with?
Well, I mean, isn't that special? The church lady, that's all Dana. I mean, the Turners would write them with him, but the character, that was something he did in his act. And Hans and Franz, I would write with Kevin and Dana, but completely their thing. They came up with the whole concept of Hans and Franz and Pump You Up and all that stuff. But with impressions, you know, Johnny Carson, that was a game where we just both threw in things. And then McLaughlin was pretty much me teaching him. That was my obsession, was the McLaughlin group.
What I loved in the McLaughlin group was
Yeah.
all the variations on everybody's name.
Something he did. I mean, he really did more tone, Kondraki. And then, you know, Odenkirk would help me a lot with those. More teeny tiny toony town. And yes, I mean, the McLaughlin group's one of my favorite things ever that I wrote with Bob. And Conan helped me on some later ones, but definitely Bob was a big part of that first one. And maybe one of the 2 or 3 funniest, for me, things that I ever got on the show, I think. And then the other one that, Regis Philbin was another one, Dana. I wrote it for Phil originally and Jan, and it even got to dress rehearsal. And it didn't do that great. And then Dana came up to me like the week later and said, in a way, I'm kind of like, more like Regis. I'm kind of little, and he's kind of little and like a little elfin. And then he started doing him, and I just couldn't believe that I had whiffed on that one. And he did a perfect Regis, and I had like some moves for it, like the move where he'd get really excited and Brokaw's over there, and I'm sitting in the back row. Anyway, they're terrific people, and we wish them well. Like that whole thing of the high energy, and then it's just an act, and we had so much fun working on those things, and that was what I shared with him creatively, was finding the music in an impression. That's what he would call it.
Now, one of the first sketches I remember where I thought, like, Phil Hartman is going to become this, like, anchor to the show, was when I understand you had a hand writing, which was the Reagan Mastermind piece, because that was really early in the season.
Yes. That was a
sketch.
piece that kind of elevated my whole, like, stature at the show. It was a big one for me.
Talk about that.
Because, Robin Williams had done Reagan the week before. He had come in as a host. We didn't really have a Reagan yet. Like, Randy Quaid had done a pretty good one the previous year. Phil hadn't done them yet. Robin came in and did the classic dizzy Reagan. He had an earpiece, and he was getting stuff to say at a press conference, and it was that whole thing of like, now put your hand up, now put your hand up, those kind of jokes, I think. I'm probably better jokes than that if Jim Downey had anything to do with it, but so I apologize. But the concept of Reagan as a dimwit just felt really tired to me at this point. And
As Jim Downey would put it, a first idea.
a first idea, yeah. I think he would agree that that was a fairly first idea. So, again, Mastermind was ultimately, the Reagan Mastermind was ultimately a sketch about comedy. Another sketch that was about comedy. It was me feeling like, let's just do the most ridiculous departure from Dizzy Reagan and make it like that he is an absolute genius and he is directing the entire, every machination, every detail of the Iran-Contra scandal. And then Dizzy, harmless Reagan is the public face. And
But those turns that Phil did are balletic.
oh yeah, well, Phil is Phil, and yeah, that was a tour de force for Phil. He was incredible. That first moment where he's bossing everybody around, and then, Mr. President, you've got your 230. It's the winner of the Girl Scout competition. Okay, bring her in here. This is the part of the job I hate. And then, hello, little girl. How are you? And, some corny line about the White House. All right, see you. Bye-bye. Back to work. Everyone rushes in, terrified of Reagan.